But how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced that I was, in reality, the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today the question I want to discuss is, was the greatest science fiction book written 200 years ago? And that book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is a classic, and I think it became a classic for three main reasons: the prose, the characters, and the themes. Now each of those are connected, but I want to break them down one by one, and then I'll let you know whether I would rank Frankenstein as one of my all-time favorite science fiction books. So let's get started with the prose. I'll be honest, I opened this book to page 1 and I found the language to be a little bit jarring. I read quite a lot of classic science fiction, but it has been a little while since I read something from the 1800s. I read the original text version of Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, and while it was a little bit of an adjustment, I did get into it after about 30 or 40 pages, which is not that bad considering recently I read Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton, which is 1,000 pages long, and that took me about 300 pages to get into, so 30 or 40 pages, not that bad of an adjustment. And once I did get into the writing style, I really enjoyed it. I read this book a little bit more slowly than I do many others because I just wanted to absorb every single word. I think you can open the book to pretty much any page and find a poetic line in it. I think there is a little bit of exposition in this book, but I just found the writing to be so beautiful and profound that I just became incredibly invested in everything that the characters were thinking and feeling. And just quickly on the style and genre, Frankenstein is considered horror, but I didn't find this book remotely scary. It was sad, it was dark, it was tragic, it was bleak, but I didn't find it scary. So if you are a horror fan, I still recommend reading it, but don't expect it to scratch that horror itch. And if you're not a fan of horror, then good news for you, this book shouldn't scare you too much. And when it comes to sci-fi, I do consider this a science fiction book because it uses fictional science as the premise for the story. It's definitely not a hard sci-fi book, as science isn't the main focus of the story from that point on, but rather the emphasis is placed on the themes and the characters. Speaking of the characters, there are a few interesting characters in this book, but I'll just focus on Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. As many of you may already know, Frankenstein isn't the name of the monster. Victor Frankenstein is the scientist that creates the monster, and I found him to be a rather interesting and an engaging character. He was smart, but not wise. He wasn't very socially intuitive, but he was someone that thought and felt very deeply. I read a criticism that said something along the lines of, people don't really talk like that, and do people talk like that now? No. Do people talk like that in 1818? Maybe, I don't know. I would guess it was more of an artistic choice, but I like the fact that Frankenstein would say what he was feeling, and he would act sometimes without thinking very much at all, because it made for a flawed, but in my opinion, authentic character. And next we have Frankenstein's monster, who doesn't have a name in the book, which I think is why people mistakenly refer to him as Frankenstein, because if he did just have a name like Stephen, then we'd all just call him Big Steve. And it was so interesting to me to learn how different this character was from how he's portrayed in popular culture. He's not this lumbering, groaning oaf. He's actually very articulate and eloquent. And that's such a fascinating part of the book, that this intellectual and emotional creature is rejected by society. And so we refer to him as Frankenstein's monster, but is it even really fair to refer to him as a monster? Well, you'll have to read the story and decide for yourself. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. I read the original 1818 text, but I did a little research on the revised 1831 text. It doesn't sound like they're overly different, but I like the sound of the raw approach in the original. So if anybody out there has read both versions, I'd love to get your take on the revisions and see if that changed your interpretations of either the characters or any of the themes. So finally, we have the thematic explorations. And this book covers so much, whether it is hubris, failure, grief, loneliness, regret, or revenge. And just to touch on a couple of those, this book doesn't really dive too far into the science behind creating the monster, or even really diving that far into Frankenstein's motivations for creating them. And in some ways, that might seem like an uncritical approach, but I actually think that is a commentary on the pursuit of power and technology. Advancements in technology can create great benefits for society, but advancements pursued purely in the name of ambition can often have unintended consequences. Something that had a great impact on me was the exploration of identity and self-worth, and how they can be affected by things like failure and loneliness, and how that can lead to feelings of regret or resentment. In this book, every action has a consequence, and every consequence leaves a mark. And how each character responds to those marks changes their personality and impacts their lives and the lives of the people around them. Every moment of failure or loss comes from an organic place within the story, and therefore we feel every character's sense of despair or desire for revenge. While at times the writing is melodramatic, it works because the strength of the themes carries this book that weighs so heavily on me. I think a mediocre book is forgettable. With a good book, you remember what happens, and with a great book, you remember how it made you feel. So, was the best science fiction book written 200 years ago? Well, for me, this book was a 10 out of 10, so it has to be up there. I'm not saying that it's a perfect read. For me, there were a few minor pacing issues and some logic gaps, but it had such an impact on me. The reading experience was so memorable that I have to place it alongside some of my all-time favorite sci-fi books. So is it number one? Not quite. I can think of a few books that impress me even more conceptually and from a storytelling perspective, but it is very high on my list, and I can definitely highly recommend it to anyone that enjoys some softer sci-fi and doesn't mind some old-timey writing. So those are my thoughts on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to check out the links to my Discord server, as well as some of the benefits of my Patreon memberships, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and a New Eden. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe. It's free, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.